All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our second annual Walter Roberts Lecture. My name is Sean Ade, and in addition to being a professor here at George Washington University, I am the director of the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication. And we are co-hosting this event with the generous support of the Walter Roberts Endowment Board, which I will mention again in a moment. I do want to let everyone know that if you want to participate in the discussion of this event online, perhaps on Twitter, you can use the hashtag IPDGC, our acronym, to join in the conversation, both on Twitter and Google+, actually. And for those of you who are tweeting the event, please distribute the live stream link to your followers, and that is go.gwu.edu/Sonenshine. All of that is courtesy of the expert work of our program assistant, Derek Gadea, who has done a great deal of work to make this event happen, as he always does. I want to give a special shout out to him, and to Mary Jeffers, who is with the State Department, currently detailed to our institute as a public diplomacy fellow, who has also done quite a lot to make this event happen.
Use the mic, please.
I'm trying to use the mic. Okay. I'll whisper into the mic and it'll be even. All right, first, before we get started, I want to do very brief introductions because we have a very tight schedule today. But I want to recognize the person for whom this lecture series is named, Walter Roberts, who's sitting here in the front row. Walter has played a significant and distinguished role in U.S. public diplomacy and U.S. foreign policy in general, since being one of the original broadcasters for Voice of America during World War II. His career at the State Department took him to, among other places, Belgrade, Yugoslavia in 1960, where he served as counselor for public affairs and worked for a time under Ambassador George Kennan. In 1969, he was appointed Deputy Associate Director of USIA, and in 1971 was elevated to the Associate Director position, then the senior career post in USIA. In 1974, he received the Distinguished Honor Award from USIA. He's a prolific author, including several journal articles just in the past few years. He would probably get tenure without any problem in our department. And his 1973 book, Tito, Mihailovic, and the Allies, is considered a classic on that topic. Walter also taught the first public diplomacy course in the country, as far as I'm aware, here at the Elliott School for a number of years, and he's still one of the most popular guest lecturers in GW's various public diplomacy classes. Walter's commitment to the academic understanding of public diplomacy led him to spearhead the creation of an endowment to create here at GW what was originally called the Public Diplomacy Institute, which is the forerunner for IPDGC. Walter continues to play an integral role in IPDGC through the Walter Roberts Endowment Board, which, as I said, is co-hosting this event, and he's a source of great wisdom and advice, and I very much value his presence not only in the Institute, but his inviting me to his apartment for various lunches, which have been a great moment in my life. And now for some brief words about our distinguished speaker tonight. Tara Sonenshine has served as the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs since April 2012. Prior to that, she was the Executive Vice President of the United States Institute of Peace, and previously was a Strategic Communications Advisor to many international organizations, including the International Crisis Group, Internews, CARE, the American Academy of Diplomacy, and the International Women's Media Foundation. She also served in various capacities at the White House during the Clinton administration, including Transition Director and Director of Foreign Policy Planning for the National Security Council, and Special Assistant to the President and Deputy Director of Communications for the NSC. She's also a former journalist at Nightline and elsewhere, and has received 10 News Emmy Awards and other awards in journalism for broadcast programs on domestic and international issues. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Undersecretary Sonenshine.
Thank you, Sean, and let me also thank Frank Sesno and ask him just to stand, because I wrote in my remarks, and I have to deliver them, that you, Frank Sesno, have been a steadfast supporter and advocate for public diplomacy and public affairs, and I am proud to count you as a friend. Thank you, Frank. And before we begin, I want to acknowledge Walter Roberts. Thanks to your generosity, this fine institute can continue its great work. You've worked, yes, for USIA, for US presidents on both sides of the aisle. You've been an administrator, an author, a teacher, and a public diplomacy practitioner. I thank you, and we all thank you, sir, for your vision, your leadership, and your service. And thank you to the GW staff, Mary, friends, and colleagues here today. Having spent the last few years at the United States Institute of Peace and now at the State Department, I can say literally and figuratively, you are great neighbors. And what I actually do want to talk about today is about neighborhoods, global neighborhoods, and how in these new global neighborhoods, traditional foreign policy and new public diplomacy have become inextricably linked to inform, support, and enhance policy in today's world through connections to people. Imagine your neighborhood. It's full of people. Neighborhoods are about people. And I honestly believe if we want to address our shared challenges and our global problems, we must engage with those people affected by those problems and by our policies. When we listen to people, we build trust and understanding. When we support people's efforts to build better futures, we are building our own future and informing our own foreign policy. And so, I think we're now engaging in public diplomacy in person and through social media. But why? Why? Because we are a force for peace and progress around the world. And that belief that we are a force for peace and progress is central to this nation's founding ideals and values. And it shall inform our public diplomacy. And that diplomacy, in turn, is most often the best way to actually carry out policies. Let me tell you a story that illustrates what I mean by bridging the intersection between policy and public diplomacy. Shortly after getting to the job, my schedule said Pakistan. I thought maybe we're going to a restaurant downtown, have some Asian food, but no, the schedule said Pakistan. So I went. And I was asked to speak at an all-girls university in Lahore. Now, at the time of my visit, tensions were particularly high. The transit points, the so-called ground lines of communication, by which the U.S. gets its supplies to and from Afghanistan through Pakistan. Just as I arrived, those transit points had become a source of irritation between the U.S. and Pakistan. And things were kind of blocked as they debated price and terms of passage. How ironic, I thought. The ground lines of communications are blocked. And I'm here on a public diplomacy mission. There were a couple of other recent events at that point that had soured things a bit, from the bin Laden raid to friendly fire deaths on the Afghan border. Let us just say there was a bit of mistrust in the air. And so it was kind of a challenging conversation to go before university students. You know how they can be. I invited students after the talk to come and chat with me privately, and a line formed. And as each one came up to me, particularly the ones who had asked the most difficult, I'd even say in a few cases, hostile questions, said something to me quietly. How do I get on one of those exchange programs to the United States? Yes, while students were critical of our policies, they still wanted to take advantage of our public diplomacy. And they had an interest to come to a country they revered and to come back to their own country and help. And this, to me, is the central point. How do you close a gap between criticism and admiration? How do you close that gap? And my answer is committed engagement. If we are committed and engaged in Pakistan, the Middle East, Africa, Central Asia, pick your place, the world needs engagement and public diplomacy, in my view, more than at any point in our history. But it won't surprise Walter, I'm sure, to know that public diplomacy was not always in the foreign policy equation, certainly not always at the table. You all know about that table, that policy table. You know, a long, oblong table, lots of, sometimes it used to be men in suits and ties, diplomats, talking politics, security, economics. That's how it was in the days of Ben Franklin, and for a long time it stayed that way. But today, public diplomacy is at the table because the aspirations of citizens are now central to the conversation. Maybe before they weren't in the room, but now even Tom Friedman writes in the New York Times, and I quote, "We live in an age of social networks in which every leader outside of North Korea today is now forced to engage in two-way conversation with citizens." Citizens, my friends, are now at the global round table. And you know what? They're texting about it. They and other non-state actors have become increasingly vital and vocal in the global equation. So I think we best try to understand them and engage across a full spectrum of issues. We need to build environments that enable people to provide for their families, the opportunity to live with the rights and freedoms that any human being wants and is entitled to. We have to think about what President Obama said recently. Why engage? Because, I quote, "our interests and our conscience compel us to act on behalf of those who long for freedom," unquote. Engagement, the president was saying, can more durably lift suspicion and fear. Secretary Clinton has described the alternative scenario to engagement. And here is what she says. When America is absent, especially from unstable environments, there are consequences. Extremism takes root, our interests suffer, and our security at home is threatened. So let me put another image in your head. Forget the table. Imagine a telescope, a good old-fashioned telescope, looking out through it at the world. There are 3 settings on my telescope: short-term, mid-term, and long-term. Those are the strategic settings of modern public diplomacy. So how would it work? Let's put an event into our telescope. Let's say somebody made a cheap, hateful video. Let's call it The Innocence of Muslims. And let's pretend it went viral. And let's imagine that the film was used by some to exploit tension, and it caused outrage, anger. And maybe in our scenario, in some countries, including several Muslim majority ones, there were sizable protests outside embassies. How would our telescopic public diplomacy deal with it? First of all, we would put on the short setting, short-term response. President Obama, Secretary Clinton went out and they made clear immediately this video was reprehensible and disgusting, and that the US government had nothing to do with it. We engaged media and influencers, and we told everyone we could we did not produce that video. While decrying the film and its hateful message, we began to move into that midterm message. Our eternal values. We began to explain religious freedom, tolerance, commitments to multi-ethnic, multi-religious societies, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. And now we're getting into the nuances in that setting. There was another aspect in the midterm, which was our public outreach to religious leaders. Example, Chad. 60% of that population is Muslim, and we have long, long ago engaged Chad's religious leaders. They like to come here on exchanges. I met with them in my office. They're fascinating and fabulous, but you know when they're really important? Right in the middle of a crisis. Because you can talk to them about interfaith dialogue and extremism and terrorism, and they trust us, and they help when you need them, when the protests spread, and you want them to lower the temperature through their own sermons and their outreach. You best have some relationships with them when you have to make those calls. And our diplomats and our public diplomats were able to utilize those channels. Now, what about that long-term setting? The lifetime setting. Academic exchange programs, English teaching programs, outreach to underserved populations, giving young people an entree to higher education, giving people technical, vocational training, opening doors. We may not see them walk through those doors for years, but when we open those avenues of economic opportunity to people, particularly young people, kids on high school programs, we know those high school kids are not going to be able to do something immediately, but we know if we help them build safe, economically secure futures, they will be a force multiplier, and they will remember well the United States. Empower future generations of political leaders who've had a positive American experience, and they are more likely to be global partners. They are more likely to be committed to the same things you are: human rights, democracy, mutual security, and prosperity. And boy, when we empower women and girls, half the sky, imagine the talent pool you unleash. economic, social, political problem solvers. So we have to support those NGOs that build civil society, those building blocks for democracy. Let me close with one last example on that long-term public diplomacy. What happens if you can't be there on the ground? What happens if you can't operate in an embassy? What about a country where you have no diplomatic presence, like Iran? How are you going to do public diplomacy in Iran? Well, you know what we do? We do it in different ways. The United States and other countries have imposed unprecedented sanctions on Iran, and we are trying to persuade them to address the international community's concerns about the nuclear program. We have a policy built on dual tracks of pressure, and yet still there is engagement. And we keep all options on the table. So if it's closed, how do you engage? We have lots of ways. We have journalists who are there for Persian News Network. We have a virtual embassy. Yes, a virtual embassy in Iran. We just marked its 1-year anniversary. How do you go to a virtual embassy? Well, take out your computer and you go to the website. And there's Farsi language social media platforms: Facebook, Google+, Twitter, YouTube. Anybody really watching it? Is anyone visiting our virtual embassy? Well, I looked at the figures. Embassy website, 2 million page hits from 4 million visitors. Facebook, 456,000 followers. Where are they, though? Nearly 61,000 of them live in Iran. 30,000 followers are on the Persian language Twitter. Oh, and as for the Persian videos we posted on YouTube, they had a few views, 800,000. It's encouraging numbers by any standard. These viewers and followers are learning about what a country's long-term commitment is to educational opportunity, freedom of expression, defense of civil liberties, and yes, a voice for the Iranian people. So, as I close, I think about some of the other things we're doing, and I hope we'll talk about them. Countering negative regime portrayals of the United States, creating debate and discussion to isolate extremists, and patiently reaching out to people every single day. Patience. Patience, I'm discovering, is not the most popular strategy in Washington. But it's actually what public diplomacy is about. No matter what the challenges, you patiently engage. You continue to be nimble in your advocacy of U.S. policy, and most importantly, take charge of the communications space so that then we can be strong defenders of those American values and ideals. Thank you so much for your rapt attention, and look forward to questions.
Thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to barge up here on stage to take the conversation and very quickly open it up. The conversation. Okay. How about if I turn it on? You know, with all this high technology.
Yes.
But I wanted to start by joining the chorus and thanking Walter for being here and for being such an inspiration and for being at the Voice of America, which was my first job in Washington, and for you and for everybody else who has worked in or is knowledgeable about special English, I just want to say, this is the voice of America. I want you to pick up really where you left off, because I was fascinated by it, where you talked about countering negative regime portrayals. That is a growing challenge. I wrote down CCTV, Russian television, Press TV, which is Iranian TV, and I went on to the Press TV, the Iranian television website today, and right up at the top, and I just copied and pasted from Press TV. Following a new round of attacks against the Iranian media, the Vice President of the Islamic Republic of Iran Broadcasting, Dr. Mohammad Sarafraz, says the Zionist system controls all the mainstream news channels in the world. Now, that's a little extreme, but they are not alone in hostility expressed and repeated and broadcast in multiple languages, including English, and joined by other networks that are expressing their hostility as well. Talk a little bit more about how you counter all these negative regime portrayals from so many different sources.
So a little bit over a year ago, before I actually arrived, I'm told that President Obama called together advisors and asked the same question. How are we countering all this stuff out there? And by executive order, created what is now known, and yet not known widely, as CSCC, which is a Counterterrorism Strategic Communications Center. And they were trying to figure out, well, where are you going to put this thing? And this thing was to be a kind of online counter-narrative place. Public, though, open, but taking these things on openly and publicly. And I guess they looked around and decided that the only person maybe not in the room that day might have been the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs. Let's put it there. So on the day I arrived, I was told, oh, and part of your portfolio is countering violent extremism. Well, over this past 10 months, I have really come to appreciate what it does. It's an interagency group. They get up in the morning and they get online and they start reading stuff like that all day long. But they're not just reading it. They're joining in the conversation. They're putting forward some corrections. They are putting forward some new information. Now, how do we know that's working?
That was going to be my question.
I know just where you're going to go. You know how they know it's working? One, we're annoying the heck out of the bad guys, because now we see in the conversations that they are actually focused on taking on what we took on when they took us on. And for one thing, we're wrapping up a whole lot of their time dealing with us now online. But more importantly is we're beginning to see that there are some gray areas with people who are prone to move toward extremist ideologies. They actually, some are open to alternative scenarios, which brings us, of course, back to why it belongs in public diplomacy, because those engagements are about creating alternative scenarios and alternative visions, alternative ways. You need a job, you need an education, you need security, you need to get to your school safely. Not everybody goes for extremism just for the heck of it. So, do we think you can reach every single extremist that way? No, but you got to get in that contested space and try.
Your life in the world, because the world is such an interesting place, gets more difficult and more complicated as we see the tensions rise with the Syrian conflict now maybe threatening to spill past borders. We had the Israeli action, and now threats from Iran and Syria potentially to form to some kind of retaliation. How do you, and yet, as recently as in his inaugural address, President Obama was saying that he is still working for and hoping for a diplomatic solution to the larger Iran standoff. How do you deploy and bring to bear public diplomacy, expertise, and influence to make more likely a diplomatic solution as the situation becomes more unstable?
Well, one way is you work with the media that's in that environment, and you try.
What does that mean?
That means you have Syrian journalists coming in and out of the country, and you try to organize media trainings for them. You try to do what USAID and other organizations often do. You try to help civil society actors, even during a conflict, in the hopes that they will be the ones who will go back and build the new Syria. Another thing, I just came from a meeting about Syria. We're helping on the cultural heritage side of this conflict. In the midst of all the human suffering and the bleeding and the conflict, pieces of Syrian history are being looted, damaged, and destroyed. The education and cultural side of the State Department works on those issues. We saw what happened in Iraq when they looted the Baghdad Museum. We know what happens when you go to rebuild your society and your fragments of history are gone. So here's a place where that midterm, long-term setting is actually being used in the midst of this conflict, so that when the day arrives when there is a new Syria and they go to build a national identity, where are all the pieces of the museums, the artifacts, Aleppo? Where's your history? That's important, even in the middle of a crisis.
A couple more, and then I'd like to turn to the audience and take your questions. Is there a microphone that will wander around the room for the audience? Yes, so Derek will have a microphone. You have this ridiculous job.
I second that.
You know, you come home, what'd you do today, Mom? Oh, I tried to talk to the world. You know, I tried to connect with the world. How do you prioritize? And what are your personal priorities and your departmental priorities when you look at this massive job that will never be done?
My first priority is your priority. And it's the same as the priority in Walter and a lot of people here. I want public diplomacy as a profession to be respected and understood. That's a macro mission. We have to explain it, not only overseas, we have to explain it in our own country. We have to build a national constituency for this. So one job from the moment I arrived was, can we talk about what this thing is? Can we give speeches and go on college campuses and go overseas to our posts and rally our own public diplomats that this is serious stuff? So that's a priority. My second priority has been what I call the E words: education, engagement, economic statecraft, entrepreneurism. Let's use this stuff to get real results. And the third, which is the hardest, I think, is this international broadcasting piece. I represent the Secretary of State on the BBG, the Broadcasting Board of Governors, and this whole debate we're going through about what is international broadcasting, also for me, is to try to help frame and think that through. And the very last piece is we have all these spaces, by the way, overseas that are called American spaces. They're actually public diplomacy hubs, 850 of them. They might be a library, a corner, a little shelf. Some of them are shelves with American books. Some are standalone centers in the middle of a mall in Indonesia. We got to pay attention to these. So my next project in this job is to kind of inventory them. Where are they? How good are they? So that's a few priorities.
That's a few. Let me drill down on one of them, the BBG and international broadcasting. And I say this with some knowledge and awareness because, as I mentioned, I have worked at the Voice of America. And I'm familiar with some of the things that have gone on around the world and some of the problems. And the Inspector General's recent report that essentially says you need to blow up the Broadcasting Board of Governors. It is inefficient, It is riven with politics, and it is unacceptable. And if we are going to compete and communicate on a global stage, this cannot go on in that way. You're going to blow up the Board of Governors?
Well, I happen to like building things instead of blowing them up,
But
so it's
sometimes you
not
have to-
exactly the analogy I would
Sometimes
use.
you have to blow up before you build.
Well, let me first, it's a theory of the case. Let me first say this. There are a lot of hardworking, as you know, people in difficult places as we sit here reporting for the Voice of America, for Radio Free Asia, for Radio Free Europe, for RL, for the Maltese, for MBN, for Persian News Network. So one thing I do want us to be careful is not to paint a broad brush when there are lots of people in very difficult environments trying to report news for people who don't get it anywhere else. Objective, independent news. So I do want to stand up for them. We talk about BBG, that's a board
Yeah,
of
but
governors.
I know, but wouldn't
So-
those brave people be better served by a Board of Governors that didn't draw a report like the one that the Inspector General actually wrote?
I think they would be better served by firstly having a chief executive officer who runs these things. A board, for anyone who's served on a board, meets maybe once a month, maybe a couple of, a board. How does a board run all of these entities? There's no CEO. That's a company without a boss. So first thing I do is before we just blow up the board, how about having a chief executive officer who reports to the board? That'd be a good start. The second thing we have to do is we have to come together and figure out what we want these entities to be doing in 2013. They need a clear mission and a mandate. It might not be the same mission and mandate as the Cold War.
What is the mission and mandate? What should it be?
I think right now it has 3 missions and mandates, and I frankly think sometimes they get a little mixed up. One is they do bring objective news and information to people who don't have another place to get it. And up until now, that's places like Burma, where you really didn't have CBS Local to tell you what Aung San Suu Kyi was doing. You have to rely on those reporters. So there's that firewall where they are operating to bring objective news and information. But they're federally funded. So there's another mission, which is support of our values and democracy, specifically freedom of expression and freedom of the press. Now, is that CBS or NBC or CNN's mission? I don't think so. That's a second mission. And the third mission is that they're really global in terms of being an information resource, like a CNN. But remember, they're operating on a budget that if you put it next to Chinese television or Al Jazeera or what the Russians spend, those are big government entities. So we're kind of matching mice and big moose here. So I think it's more complicated than just a report or, I understand it deeply, and I understand that there's some sorting out of mission, and I understand that there's tensions around how you operate with multiple entities under a board that doesn't supervise you day in and day out. It's pretty strange.
A dysfunctional board that doesn't supervise you day in and day out. I don't mean to harp on this, but it's important because so much of what America projects is projected through the international broadcasting, which is not just broadcasting anymore. It's many of these websites that you talk about. This is how we can, largely how we convene the conversation. So interesting, you talk about the exchanges, the student exchanges, you talk about the virtual embassy, we have international broadcasting. So we're fighting this war of ideas, or adjoining the marketplace of ideas on all of these fronts. And they all have to work if we're going to compete against all this other stuff, right?
It is hard in a world in which there's so much broadcasting already. Think about the competition that has grown up in these Arab Spring countries, how many outlets, satellites, cable channels, new newspapers, online, websites, Twitter, Facebook. So we're also talking about competing in a global marketplace that is saturated. And people walking around for the most part with mobile devices, not even turning on televisions in lots of places. They're just looking for it right in a PDA.
Are we losing or winning this war?
I think it's the wrong question because there is no way, unless you're going to count eyeballs or viewers, how are you going to stack up this score sheet? If you define winning and losing for me, I promise you I would use that win-lose, but I can't get anyone to tell me what they think the win column is and what the lose is.
So, and last one, I promise. So how do you measure your success?
You measure success depending on the vehicle you're using. If we're using educational exchanges, I'm not going to measure how many kids were really just on a program. What I'm going to do is look at where they are 5 years later. And you know what? 92% of the people who go on U.S. government exchanges go on to work in civil society positions, in the parliament or in an NGO. They're working for something positive in their country. That's a win. When I look at Nobel Prize winners who were Fulbrights, I put that in the win column. So what I'm saying to you is to have this one win or lose measurement. In what time frame? In what, on
well,
what?
We're Americans. We want it this quarter. I mean,
Yeah.
right?
Good luck.
That's the problem. That's why
That's
you
the
talk about
problem.
patience.
That's the
because
problem.
this is in it for the long haul. I want to open the conversation to your questions now. So anybody, let's come right up to the front row here. And if I could ask you to stand and introduce yourself and keep your question brief, we'll get in as many as we can because I know your time is short.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. Are you able to use the internet in your efforts, and can you bring in people from the other countries and their opinions and get them to participate in projects that the State Department or USAID might do in funding things?
Were you able to hear the question in
Yeah,
the
the
back?
question is how we use the internet. I've done already a couple of global Twitters live in 9 languages. Where
Do
people,
you speak 9 languages?
No.
I'm very impressed.
No, but I sit in a room with a bank of translators, and we watch the questions come in whatever language, and they're translated. I respond, my answer is translated back, and it's posted in real time. That's a global conversation.
Do you know who's tweeting you from these other countries, or
Oh,
what,
sure.
how old they are? Or, I mean, what do you know about
Yeah, I mean, we don't try to go deep into who everybody is. You get a collective, you get a sense of how many people. When I came in April, I was told I had to have this Twitter thing. And I said, well, what are we going to call it? And they said, @Sonenshine. I thought, well, that's really creative. Who's going to go to that? And that was in May. The person here who set it up, Ashley Garrigus, is here, and she said, don't worry, we're going to get followers. And we're going to know how many, and we're going to know what they say. And I said, well, you're going to call like all my cousins? I mean, how are you going to get followers? And by the way, growing up, if I told my parents someone was following me, you called the police. Today, I don't know, what's our number today? She could go right on and tell you.
Over 4,500.
I don't know who these 4,500 people are. She can tell you who they are, but they tweet. I tweet something, they tweet, we retweet. It's from Russia, it's from Libya, it's from... This is where the world conversation is happening. And mine is only 10 months old. There are people, Alec Ross had how many?
He's got, I think, over 100,000 by now.
360, there's our guru. He says 360,000 people follow one guy at the State Department.
If you could turn U.S. foreign policy and public diplomacy into a series of cat videos, you could get millions.
Yeah, but now I'm told they're very evil, if you
Oh,
saw the
well, okay.
latest cat
I see.
video.
There's a question in the back.
Hello, I'm Harvey Leifert. I'm a retired USIA Foreign Service officer. And my question has to do with security at embassies and the lack of people who do what I did when I was there. American corners are great, but as I understand it, they're not staffed by any American officers. And I'm wondering if the pendulum might start swinging back the other way.
Well, firstly, thank you for your service in the Foreign Service and to USIA. And the security issue is difficult. And every day now, the State Department has to assess, as they always do, and reassess security. And there is a tension sometimes between what public diplomacy officers want to do and what they can do, which, thank goodness, the virtual technology enables us to do some of that. But I think we have to kind of push through on making our point that we still need face-to-face engagement. We still need to get out and talk to people. And the American corners, sometimes having the Russian staff person or the Middle East staff person is actually a really good thing, that you have locally engaged staff at some of these facilities who know the culture and know the language. So I'm less concerned about that piece, but I am concerned about their ability to operate and their ability to be financially sustainable, all of these centers to have access and accessibility so people can get to these centers, and that we can evaluate what they're really delivering. Because we're under scrutiny in this budget climate. We have to show results, quantitative and qualitative.
I mean, that's, you ask me, over what period of time do you have to show results and what is success? The real question is, what do you have to show the Hill and over what period of time to get the resources you need?
Well, I am hopeful that, we've been fortunate to have a secretary who really goes out as a public diplomat, and boy, does she make the case. And I'm very hopeful and excited that our incoming secretary does know a thing or two about the Hill also, and seems very engaged already in engagement, understands public diplomacy, talked about it in a private meeting with us and in his public hearing.
How will he change public diplomacy as practice?
I don't know, I'd give him a day, see how he finds his way around the building.
But if he's had the private meeting, tell us what he told you.
He told us that he understood how vital this function is. He's chaired 28 years worth of hearings. I think he's probably knows more about this terrain and foreign policy in general. I think he also understands the need to build the domestic constituency for this, and understands that changes that we can talk about, the modernization of Smith-Mundt and others, give us some added space here to do a little bit more of that. So I think he'll be a cheerleader. As they say with all new marriages, time will tell, and we'll see how it goes.
Okay. Next question. Let's come back up front here, Derek, and then move to that side of the room.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Alenko. I'm a freshman here at the Elliott School, and I have two questions for you. The first is the virtual embassy in Iran sounds wonderful, but what are you going to do if the Iranian government suddenly blocks it? And then what do you have in place for countries like China where you are blocked on the internet? And my second question is a little unrelated, but how do you explain to people who live under authoritarian systems that we aren't authoritarian when they haven't had these kinds of experiences?
Two great questions.
Two great questions, yes.
One, I don't have to wait to see how it is when the Iranians block our virtual embassy, because they do it constantly. Cat and mouse game. We put some stuff up, satellite mysteriously, the internet suddenly goes down. And in some ways that helps us, because that says they're paying attention and that it's annoying them. And that's fine. So you just get up every day and say, try again. And people do get through. They may get blocked for a little while, but they'll get back on there. And that knowledge we have that they're getting back on, it gives you so much energy to go try again. China, I think, is a whole other conversation, but I want to make sure I get to your second question before we come back there, which was about young people under authoritarian regimes and how would they come to appreciate some of the freedoms that they've never had. The best way is when they are in your country. And I'll give you an example. Our ambassador in Libya was murdered on, I think it was a Tuesday, September 11th, 12th. The day after, I saw on my schedule that I was meeting with a group of high school students from overseas. And I walked down to the briefing room, to the conference room, and it was a very sad day at the State Department. People were in shock.
Did you know him?
I had met him. And people were just, they were shell-shocked. And so I went down there, and on my way in, I was told these high school kids are from Libya, Tunisia, and Egypt. Day after. Now, you go into a room of 16, 17-year-olds, and you ask them where they're from, and they're from Benghazi, and Tripoli, and Cairo, and Tunis. And as you go around the room, you ask them to introduce themselves, and I have teenagers, so I know what they're like. Every single kid in the room said, "May I begin, Madam Undersecretary, by expressing my condolences to you." Now, my son can't say I'm sorry for anything. So this was, but then they went on to say in their own ways, "We hope you won't judge us based on this incident. We really want to learn about your freedoms and what it is. And our parents wanted us to come. And we want to go back and explain what we've seen." You don't need a textbook to explain to a high school kid who's lived in an authoritarian country what it's all about. You put them 3 weeks in the United States, you're pretty sharp. Tell you one last piece of this. I went to Bosnia a couple of months ago, and I knew Dayton Accords were 17 years ago. It was like talk about being in something for the long haul. And what I was shocked was to see that in certain schools, Serb kids and Muslim kids and Bosniak kids and Croat kids can't go to school together. It's still so ethnically divided. I was surprised. But these kids I met with from all 4 groups had just come back from Seattle, Washington. In their own country, they could not really be together, and their parents and grandparents hate each other. So they said it was kind of hard leaving on this trip to Seattle, Washington, because, you know, they're with people that are kind of icky from that other ethnic group. And of course, on their time together, they bonded, and they came back, and the ambassador and I went to meet with them. You look in their eyes, they want to change the country. They want to explain to their grandparents that they were all wrong about those atrocities during the war. And the key thing, I said, so what was your perception of America when you left? And what was it when you came back? One girl stood up, she said, "Well, I thought everyone was going to be fat." You can't make that up. And she said, "Not everybody was fat, but you had a lot of fat people." And she said, "But I was so amazed in Seattle that there were Hispanics and Koreans and African Americans. I mean, you have such an ethnically diverse." I don't have to give her a textbook. So, engagement, experience, touching the country, those are the things that change.
Time for one more, and let's come up to the front here.
David Hitchcock.
Hang on one second, David Hitchcock. A microphone is coming to you. Thank you.
Yes, I wonder if you, unless you already have, because I came a little late today, but talk a little bit about the personnel side of public diplomacy, the extent to which the sizes, the dimensions, but more than that, the training, particularly the training, including language, and to what extent are we moving in the right direction? Thank you.
Well, luckily, I have some PD cone officers, if there are any in here, they're welcome to raise their hands. PD officers. And the reason that I think they're smiling is I'm spending a lot of time on this career development training piece. You can't go out and say you want to help public diplomacy as a field without suddenly finding yourself in the nitty-gritty of personnel and how people move through the PD system. What kind of FSI training, what kind of language? Do they progress on a career track that leads a public diplomacy person to be a chief of mission? Are they respected as greatly as the econ officer or the political officer? So I have learned quickly that this is really partly where the rubber meets the road, is making sure your public diplomacy folks are coming in and they're getting good experience and good training and good opportunities and good exposure and good advancement. Because without that, who would want to come in and do it? And those young people doing masters in public diplomacy, we got to reach them. They have to know this is robust and rich territory and that this is the time to come do it. So I do think you've asked really the key question, because in the end, what you're asking is about people. The computer is a piece of technology. At the end of the day, it's still the wisdom and the judgment of ordinary people doing extraordinary work. So thank you.
Thank you. My last question for you to sort of sum this up, Tara, is fascinating to listen to you and to think about what public diplomacy is and the challenges that it confronts and that we confront in this incredibly supersonic world, complicated world, where you've got counter-narratives coming at you from every different direction, where our own narrative is sometimes confusing. What do you do in Libya versus what you do in Syria? And you know all of that. What friendly fire and the use of drones. I mean, it's a very complex narrative. And I'm interested to hear you talk, as you have, about exchange programs and about our representation on the ground in these countries versus virtual embassies and Twitter and Facebook followings. As you think about the future of public diplomacy, does the center somehow change given the wired and wireless world? Or is the center still and will continue to be the face-to-face, the people-to-people, that really is the core of what it's been in many ways till now?
You know, I think the answer is blended learning and blended. We're in a blender right now, and we're going to have to blend this educational online resources with traditional classroom learning. They're going to have to be blended. We're going to have to blend the 3 weeks in Seattle with 3 hours in an online exchange. We're going to have to blend what we tweet out and what we say in a long journal piece. So I think this convergence that we're all still going through as we try to thread the different pieces into a whole, we're in the midst of it. We're not quite sure, is it 50-50, is it 60-40? We don't yet know what the mix is, but I think the answer is going to be a mix.
Great. And your tweet to the room and beyond, 140 characters, for why some young person here should go into public diplomacy is?
You want to be at the intersection of global communications and global policy? If either of those two fields, if you care about information, communications, international affairs, and people, if you don't, pick something else.
It's a little bit more than a tweet, but it's very good.
Thank you very
I would like
much.
to. I want to thank Tara. I have known Tara for a long time, and I think that, and the message that I would just, because she won't say this, but I will to our students and young people in this room. Tara's someone who has taken her career and dedicated toward information and towards the dissemination of information amongst different constituencies, and now, most challenging of all, a global constituency, sometimes global adversaries. But what you are doing is incredibly important. And in the marketplace of ideas, in the world that is flat and hot and crowded, the United States of America has to engage this in a very aggressive but truthful way, transparent way. And we're inventing and experimenting with these new things every day. And I'd like to close where I began by thanking Walter and the Voice of America, and while I'm at it, shouting out to the director of the Voice of America, my friend David Ensor, who's here with you and with us as well. Tara, thank you very much. There is food and drink and recepting going on, or to go on, one floor up, so I hope you'll join us after the evening as well. Thank you all very much.